Hello, Dan, and welcome. I'm going to be interviewing you today about comic books, mostly graphic novels, but anything that comes up in that way. Dan, how would you define yourself relating to comics?
Well, I'm mainly a comic book enthusiast. I have been for many years. Ever since I was a kid, I read lots and lots of comic books, and in fact, I watched all the cartoons dealing with comic books. It's one of my favorite childhood pastimes.
How long have you been collecting comics?
Well, I've been collecting comics since I was about, say, 6 years old. Started off with like Daredevil and a lot of Marvel comics, and just kept on collecting, and it really caught on.
What do you consider the most influential thing about comics?
Very easily the way the stories are told, the way it goes from panel to panel, showing all the different, forms that everything can go and take. They have a very magical way of actually telling how a story should go. You have all the narrative and everything like that, and you have the picture going, and telling a story itself at the same time. So that's one of the most influential things about comics.
Do you believe that comics are just children's stories? Or do you think they are more than just a childhood fantasy?
Of course, they're more than just a childhood fantasy. I mean, you have so many comics these days, and the maw of the comics are really widening. You see, DC comics and Marvel comics, and they're really working to go and expand the whole source by making printings like Dark Horse and Vertigo specifically meant for older aged people.
So, believing this form of media is more than just for children, what adult implications can you associate with the comic trade?
Well, there's a lot of adult situations and things of that nature that really go and influence comics. Like there's a lot of talk about love in comic books, looking up to your own hero in comic books. There's also dealing with the death of loved ones or really close ones. You know, personal demons and dealing with them. There's all kinds of things. The loss of one's father or just family period. Even, the shunning from an entire society to go and throw someone to the outside. Racism, feminism, things like that. Just being different on a general whole.
Do you believe that the art has a drastic effect on the comic? That it wouldn't be the same without it?
Of course, art has a drastic effect on the comic. If you didn't have the artwork in the comic, all you would have is really a very large and well-written lump of narrative, which unfortunately does not a story make. Also goes to say if you have a different artist instead of, the current artist that's on there, it could work out better or worse depending on how they decide to go and portray the particular images. It all depends on who's drawing.
On the reverse side, do you believe that the art needs the story, or could it just stand on its own?
I think it can really go and stand on its own, personally. Like I was saying earlier, without the actual images itself, you'd have a very large lump of narrative, and you could make some kind of sense out of it, but not real kind of logical sense. The art is really what spells out the story for everyone. So you have these words to go and match up. If you took out all the words, you could substitute your own in, or you could even just see what's happening and piece together what exactly is happening in the world that you're currently viewing. So the art can definitely stand alone.
Can you see how comics can have an effect on teaching techniques? And if so, what implications could it pose on the educational world?
Well, definitely it has an effect on teaching techniques. I personally believe that it really goes and spurs the kind of creativity, Like, you go and you look at any kind of comics, and first off, it can be used to go and teach people how to go and read more into the story. You can see lots of things in the artwork that otherwise would go unnoticed. It's a different way of telling a story, and for that you can go and teach lots of different things, with the main one definitely being creativity, along with there's so many prolific writers out there that it really becomes something that you can really go and admire the actual writing of the format.
In your opinion, what is the most influential comic in history? And why is it so influential?
Most influential comic in history. Well, I would say that would go to Frank Miller, The Dark Knight Returns. And the reason why it's so influential is simply because Frank Miller basically took, the cheesy comic books from like the 1940s and 1950s, and he transformed it to a whole different kind of format, which is the noir form. You have this dark kind of brooding detective and everything like that, and it goes more into the death details and basically made it for an older audience, which is something you hadn't seen before. Comic books used to be for kids, they used to go and include it with bubblegum and stuff. So that's really a turning point in the comic book history.
What about the most influential comic art in history?
The most influential comic art in history? I really think that that's kind of a hard one to go and answer, because in the 1980s is when all of these artists came out of the woodwork as far as, actually making the genre more appealing towards older people. And for that, there's so many things that are influential to that end, maybe Jim Lee, just because of how stunning and, just ridiculously awesome his artwork is. Or Frank Miller, he actually, drew quite a bit of his own artwork, and, he was one of the people, not only did he flesh out the narrative, but he also fleshed out, the dark kind of way that comic books are done nowadays. So it'd probably be under Frank Miller again, and that's where I stand on that one.
The most influential story.
Most influential story in history. I think that Batman is really sweeping all of this away, personally. The most influential story, I think, can really be attributed to a book actually called Batman at Arkham Asylum, written by Grant Morrison. And that one was really interesting because it took the whole gallery of villains and it gave them all mental issues that Batman had to go and parse out. If you're familiar with Harvey Dent, or the character known as Two-Face, he had, multiple personality syndrome, and they tried to go and compensate it by giving him multiple coins and even like more dye and everything like that to go and split up his decisions instead of making it a flip of the coin. So it went from one decision to 6 decisions, and it came to the point where he couldn't make decisions by himself anymore, and he would go and say soil himself before he even got a chance to, make a decision whether or not he should go and do something. That one was really, really influential. It made comic books very dark.
Who do you believe is the most influential comic writer in history?
Without a doubt, that has to go to Alan Moore. If you don't know who Alan Moore is the one responsible from doing a number of movies, or rather, Alan Moore is responsible for having a number of movies based on his comics. These include Swamp Thing, From Hell, Watchmen, V for Vendetta. Now you may think that something like From Hell or Swamp Thing is actually kind of cheesy, but that's only because the movies portrayed it as so. Really, they were very, very compelling stories for their time, and Alan Moore is the one that brought them there. If you look at his other stories, like V for Vendetta, he wrote that in the 1980s to go against the current queen at that point in time and her views on politics, The original character in the story was actually an anarchist and not a terrorist. The movie makers went and actually formatted that one so it was anti-Bush propaganda, and really, comic books at that point in time, he's so influential that it even affected politics, which is why it has to go to Alan Moore, because he brought a real-world aspect. Watchmen, if you haven't seen it, is a movie of what if heroes really existed. There's a lot of inner politics there. You see them fight against, Richard Nixon. You see them, people don't want the help of heroes, all that kind of thing. And, how human these people are, these people who try to go and protect us. He has to be the most influential of all time. Alan Moore is a god in the comic book industry.
I thank you, Dan.
It's no problem, Carl. Thank you very much. Have a good class.